Hey, what's up guys? In today's video, we are going to be learning how to build a custom data scraper, but it will be for a very unique type of website. So if you see here, we're on this website called Car Whale, and I'm going to go to, I'm just going to search like used cars, for example. And now I basically want to show you how to scrape this data, right? If I scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see it's going to say loading, and then it'll automatically load more listings. So if I scroll to the bottom, you see it says loading, and then it loads more items. So this is very similar to how social media websites work, like Facebook and LinkedIn. It just automatically loads as you scroll down. So this is common on quite a few websites. For example, this is another website. It's a property website. So let me just search some random results and see if I scroll to the bottom, it'll then automatically load more listings, as you can see there. So that's different to other websites like, for example, Property 24, where after you scroll through all the listings, if you want to see more, you have to click on the next button, or you can click on the next page like that. So there's actually a word for that. It's called pagination, and this is useful when you're using the data scraping wizard, which is provided in UiPath. But if your website doesn't have a next button to load more items and it loads automatically like this, you're going to have to build a custom data scraper as opposed to using the wizard, because this has the pagination. Same example here on Google, they also have this next button thing. So let me open up UiPath. And I'll basically show you why we can't use the data scraping wizard on this website. So I'm just going to choose a random car model. I know, let's go with Fiat. All right. So there's 159 cars here. I'm just going to refresh this page. I'll come here and I'm going to start a new process. And I'll call this used cars scraping bot. Right, I'll save this in my D drive and I'll click create. So just waiting for that to load up, and I'll click open main workflow. So let me just show you a demo with the data scraping over here. So this is the wizard, and it says here, open your browser or application or document and navigate to where you want to extract the data. So here we are on the Car Whale website. Press next in this dialog and hover the mouse cursor over the data source field. So I'm going to scrape the names, and then it says click that field. So I'll click next. So I will click on this field, and then it says you selected a table. Would you like to extract the data from the whole table? We're going to click no. All right. And the reason for this is because it's probably detecting all the elements inside this listing as a table. So we'll click no. Then it says to create a pattern, you need to indicate a similar field, preferably the last in the collection. So it's hard to choose the last in the collection here because you have to keep scrolling all the way to the end. So I'll just select the second listing, just like that. So I'll give this a name. I'll call it name, and then I'll even extract the URL, and I'll call this URL, and I'll click next, and here we have it. So you can see it extracts the name of the car and the URL of that specific listing. So that's the URL. If you click into it, if you click that, it'll open in a new URL, and that's the URL it's basically scraped. Right, so we can see here that this has now scraped a limited number of items, and we can even set here 0, right? So this will scrape the maximum number of results. So it'll basically be all of them that it can scrape. And then I'll click finish. All right, then it says, is data spanning multiple pages? And then it says it could be a next button or an arrow, not a page number. Press yes to indicate it. So of course, we can't do that here because, like I mentioned, we don't have the next button option like we do on other websites. So I guess here I'm forced to click no, and there is the activities the wizard creates for us. It's the attach browser, which attaches to the Carwell website, and the extract structured data activity with the output table of extract data table. Right, so that's a variable over here that it created for us. So let's try write this to the output panel and see what it looks like. So I'm going to come search for output data table activity to convert the data table into a string. So over here I'll put our extract data table variable, and in the text I'm going to right click create a variable, and I'll call this string dt. So this is just a temporary variable. Right, so there it is, string dt, and then I'll use a write line activity to write the string to the output panel. All right, so I'm just going to close all these other websites that we're not going to be using, and I'll just keep this one open to here. Right, and I'm also going to refresh this page. All right, so it's as if a user just landed on it, and I will then click run. So you look at our output, and we can see here that it scraped a whole lot of listings, but it didn't scrape every listing. Remember, we have 159 cars for Fiat here, and we can see in the output that this is definitely less than 159. We can actually count them, but it's a bit time consuming to do that, so I'll leave that for now. But basically what I want to show you is, let's say I loaded everything, right? If I keep scrolling down to the bottom and I basically try load everything. In fact, you can even press the button on your keyboard, which is the end button. It's next to the home button. If you keep clicking the end button, it'll scroll all the way to the end of your browser, right to the bottom. So I'll keep clicking end, and we can see now we reached the end because we got this little message saying to find more cars, blah, blah, blah. So now that we have scraped, or not scraped rather, but scrolled through and made all our listings available, let's run this and see if it now scrapes everything. So we come to our output panel. We can see here that it scraped the same amount of cars as before. So this actually didn't actually make a difference. All right, so let's try and build a custom data scraping wizard, which is able to scrape all of the listings on this page, even if we have scrolled down a bit. All right, so what we can do to do this is we can use a while loop and loop through the indices. So the first listing is going to have an index of 1, second listing will have an index of 2, third listing will have an index of 3, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a while loop and a counter variable to loop through those indices. So I'm going to delete this attached browser. I'll delete all these activities, we don't need them. And I'm also going to come to our variables over here, and I'm going to delete these. I can just press this remove unused variables button and it'll then delete them. Great, so now we're back to a clean slate. I'll rename the sequence main, and I'll drag in our while activity. I'll drag that in, and I'll create a new variable, and I'll call it the counter. All right, and the counter, we need to set this to an integer variable type, right? And I'm going to set a default value of 1. So the first value of the counter will be 1, and then we're going to increment the counter to add 1 each time it loops. So it'll be 1, 2, 3, etc. So we have our condition here where the counter must be less than or equal to, and then I'll just put a random number, let's say 100. So this means we want to scrape the first 100 listings. And then I'm going to come here and I'm going to use an assign activity, and I'm going to increment the counter by saying counter equals, and then I'm pressing Control space on my keyboard for this IntelliSense to pop up, and I'll select counter plus 1. Great, so now I'm also just going to use a write line just to test this over there, and I'm going to put our counter variable, and then I'm going to say dot to string, right? Because remember, the write line requires a string expression, as we can see over here. It requires a string, so that's why I'm converting the integer into a string. Cool, so I'm going to run this, and let's see if it loops through 100 numbers. There it is. So you can see how it's looping through the while loop, and then this should end at 100. Perfect. So if we look at our output panel, the first value was 1 and the last value of the counter was 100. So that's working great. Right, so next step, what we can do is we can use a get text activity. All right, so I'll drag in a get text, and I'm going to indicate this, this first listing over here. So I'll select that, and let's open up our selector to see what this looks like. So you can see we have the app in Chrome. All right, the title, this is the name of the browser. That is basically the same name that it shows up here. Right, then we have the index, which is 1, the parent ID linked to details, and tag span attribute. So I'm just going to replace all this text in the title with a wildcard besides for the name of the website. This is just good practice. I'll validate that and highlight, and it identifies it correctly. If I change this index to 2, let's see if it will identify the one on the right. Yes, it does. There you go. So now if we change it to 3, validate, highlight, let me scroll down and press highlight again, and we can see it identifies the third index. So what we can do is we can actually replace this index property with our counter variable. So press Control Space on my keyboard, select the counter, and we can see that it adds these double braces in the beginning and the end of the variable. So we have now made a dynamic selector by entering a variable into the selector. Right, so we can click OK, and we can then create an output variable for our get text. So Control K, and I'll call this car name. Great, so we can rename this from get text to get car name, and then we can even try and use a write line activity, or rather let's use a log message. Very similar, right? So basically the difference between a write line and a log message is the write line will always log a info level message, which means in the output panel it'll be a little eye icon like that for info. Whereas if you use a log message, you have fatal error warning, info, trace, and those are these different types of logs you could get. As you can see, if we hover, it says error, warning, information, trace. Right, so that's what those these log levels are. So I'm just going to keep it to info, right? And over here, I'll put the car name. So if I log a message with info car name, it's the same as logging a write line for the car name. It's exactly the same thing. Cool. Then for this write line, I'm actually going to add another log activity, also in info, and I'll call this, I'll put some text and I'll say scraping listing number, and then I'll put a hashtag for the number, and then I'll plus, and then I'll concatenate the counter variable dot to string. There you go. So now at the beginning of the loop, it'll tell us which listing it's trying to scrape. And once it's done that, it'll scrape the car name. It'll then log the name of the car. I can then delete this write line. We don't need that anymore. And we then increment the counter. So I'm going to refresh this page, right? So that it is basically as if the bot just landed on this page, right? Without all the listings loaded. And I'm then going to come here and run this. Right, so let's see if this is now scraping. So you can see that it's scraping all the names dynamically, just as we liked. Right, but I'm assuming this is going to stop soon. Let's have a look. As you can see, it has now stopped. So it scraped until listing index 29, but once it tried to scrape listing index number 30, it can't find it. And that's because it hasn't loaded yet. So if I scroll down to the bottom of this page, you'll see it be loading. Now that it's loaded, if I come back here, you'll see it's continued to scrape. So we can see now it's past listing index 30, and now it's scraping. It should probably stop soon eventually. As you can see there, it just stopped again. It scraped till listing 53. So basically, we need to create some type of system within our loop which will scroll down if there are more items to scrape. So let's do that quick. I'm going to click stop here. And to do that, we can use a element exists activity. So I'll search for element exists. Here it is. Right, we don't want the computer vision one, we just want the normal element exists, and I'll drag that in over there. So remember earlier we had that message right at the bottom when we reached the last listing. It actually told us that we reached the last listing. So we can basically check that if it isn't showing that last message, then it means we must keep scrolling. So I'm just going to keep scrolling down, or I'll press end on my keyboard just to keep scrolling, and here we are. So this is the message, which means we have reached the bottom of the listings, and I'll come here, indicate on screen, and I'll select this text to find more cars, blah blah blah. So let's open up our selector. Let's see, maybe we can make this a bit more of a robust selector. So I'm just opening in UI Explorer by clicking that button. Let's see, let's maybe check the rname property over here, which contains the text to find more cars, because we know this is static, it's not going to change. And maybe we replace all this text here in the title with a wildcard, just in case we're searching some other type of cars. All right, I'll validate that, highlight. As we can see, it's working. So we can click save. Okay. And then we can create an output variable for the exists, and we can see here that this is a Boolean. So I'll come here and create a variable, and let's call this last listing or let's rather say completed loading. All right, we can click OK. So you can see in the output panel over here, sorry, not the output panel, the variables panel, the completed loading is a Boolean, and by default this is false. All right, and this will only become true if it is able to find this text. All right, so what we can do is we can use a if activity, right, and I'll drag the if just below that, and our condition will be our completed loading. So if it has completed loading, then we basically do nothing. So we can leave the then blank. Else, if it hasn't completed loading, we want to scroll down. So we can use a send hotkey activity. Here it is. I'll drag that into the else, and we can trigger the end. Where is end? There it is. So this will press end on the keyboard, and it'll also be a good idea to indicate on screen the browser, just like that. Let's also just come and make this browser dynamic with the title over here. So I'll add a wildcard, and I'll validate, highlight. That should be fine, and I'll click OK. Right, so instead of send hotkey, I'm just going to rename this to scroll to page bottom. Then I'll have a condition here, if still loading. Right, this element exists. I'll say check if loading completed. Right, and then this while is scrape listings. Let's see what else we can rename. I think that's fine for now. And assign, I'll just call this increment counter. Cool. So this should now actually scroll down and be able to scrape all 100 listings as we have set it over here, as opposed to stopping after the 30th one because there are no more to load. So I'm going to come back. Let me refresh this browser. Close that. And let me come back here and run this. All right, so we can see now that it's not scraping immediately, and the reason for this is because it's busy checking if this element exists. So I'm just going to stop here, and the reason for that is we need to change the timeout for this element exists activity. So the default is 30 seconds, which if we hover here, it'll say the default value is 30,000 milliseconds. So what this is doing is it's taking 30 seconds to try and find this. If it doesn't find this within 30 seconds, it'll then assign false to the completed loading variable. If it does find it within 30 seconds, it'll then assign true to the completed loading variable. So we don't want to wait 30 seconds for every single iteration of this while loop. So I'm just going to make this much shorter. I'm going to maybe set this to 500 milliseconds. So that's half a second as opposed to 30 seconds. So now this should loop a lot faster. So let's try again. I'm going to run this. And there you go. We can see it's actually scrolling down now. It's pressing end. It's using the send hotkey end on the keyboard to load all the items. So that's good. It looks like it's still busy loading everything. So that's probably it. That's probably loaded everything. It's probably found the elements. If I just scroll down, yeah, we can see that's there, which means it's no longer scrolling, but it's probably still scraping. So if we come here, we can see now it's past listing 30 because obviously it's available to scrape, and it is now continuing to scrape all of the listings. So I'm just going to let this run to the end just to make sure that this is working fine and there aren't any other problems that it's going to cough up. So it's nearly at 100. So things are looking good. And done. There we have it. So it scraped all the listings. Now let's say we wanted to scrape the URL of all these listings as well. So if we click on it, it will have a URL over there. So let's say we wanted to scrape that too. What you can do is let's come here and we can use the UI Explorer, and let's try and see if we can find the URL of the listing. So let's take this first one, for example, this Fiat Aventura. We'll open that up, right? So this is the URL we want to find. It'll say used cars in Hyderabad, Fiat Aventura. So if I come here, indicate element, and I'll select this again. Now I'm just going to wait for this to load. Right, so if I scroll down to the bottom, click on this. Now we want to look at the attributes on the right hand side for a URL property which will contain that URL we just saw. So you can see it's not available here. If I come up to a level above that, look for URL property, nothing. Keep checking here, nothing. No URL, no URL, no URL there, nothing there, nothing there. I don't think, no. Oh wait, what is this? href, used cars in, yeah, so this looks like the URL. Alright, so see if there was any other href. Href here, there's the URL. Alright. Yeah, so we can basically use this level. I'll check this block, right? And actually, we don't even need to check this block. What I can do is we can use the get attribute activity. So I'm going to come here and below the get car name, I'm going to use a get attribute. And I'll drag that in over there. and I'll indicate that over there, right, the name of the car, but we already have defined the selector. So I'm actually just going to copy paste the selector over here since we have our dynamic counter variable in there already. Validate and click OK. So now I'm going to click on this drop down and we want the href property. Let's see if we can find that here. Href. That's not it. So it looks like it is not available over here. I wonder if we come edit the selector, maybe if we include let's try include the second level. Alright, so this one here, which includes href, I'll check this property, right? And the R name I'm going to uncheck because that's going to be different. And let me also maybe uncheck the CSS. I'll actually uncheck all these properties, except for maybe I'll keep the row name. Oh no, I won't keep row name. We need to keep this as dynamic as possible. I'll keep the parent ID. Alright, let me try save that. Click OK, see if href is now available here. It doesn't seem like it. So let's try use another way. In fact, instead of doing that, let me just do this. Let's just write href over here. Just type it manually, even though it's not an option here. Let's just try type href like that and see if it works. All right, so let me just refresh this browser. Oh, and before we even get to that, let me just create an output variable, Control K, call this URL. Right, and in the log messages over here, I'm going to log an info message with the URL. Right, so instead of get attribute, I'm going to call this get URL. And let's try and run this. Alright, so it's doing the scrolling, which is good. Now I'm going to open this up. Okay, I'm going to stop here because we can see that it's not able to identify the URL. Remember we typed in href over here and it's actually not able to find it. Let me change this href to URL and see if that works. URL, right, and I'll click run. It's doing the scraping. Oh, it looks like it's scraping a URL, but it's not the URL we want. So I'm just going to click stop here. We can see that the URL that it's scraping over here, we can see they're all the same, which is basically, if I copy paste this URL, if I copy that and paste it here, we'll see it's just going to take us to the same URL where it's scraping all the listings, not the URL of the listing itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tweak this workflow to basically open up, to actually click on each listing so that it'll open in a new URL so that we can get this URL. So the way we can do that is you scroll back to the top, come back here, and we can use a click activity to click onto the car name. So I'm just going to delete this get URL for now. We don't need that anymore. And I'm going to use a click. right? And we are going to want to click on the listing. Oh, I think I just did something wrong there. Just a second. I indicated the button which says indicator on screen. I'm just going to click indicator on screen again, and I'll scroll down a bit. I just clicked F2 on my keyboard so I can scroll down, and now I'll click that. Great. I'm also going to come and copy paste the selector, since we want it to be the exact same selector that we click into over here. Right, validate, okay. So now we'll say click into browser. Right, ensure that simulate click is checked so that the clicking happens in the background. So once it's now clicked, it will, if it clicks on here, it's going to open a browser like this. We then want to attach to this browser. Right, so we can use an attach browser activity. Attach browser, I'll drag that in, indicate on screen, and I'll select this entire browser. So let's have a look what our selector looks like. So it has Chrome, and then the title is all of this. So we can see this for sale. This is probably standard on any car that we choose. So let me come choose a random one just to check that. If I come here and I look at the title, we can see that it does include the text for sale. So what we can do here is we can actually just replace all this text on the left of for sale with a wildcard, and all the text on the right of the for sale with a wildcard. Validate, highlight, should be good. I'll click OK. So now we have attached to the browser. So I'll say attach to car listing browser. And next steps is we want to use a get attribute. Right, so I'll drag in a get attribute. Okay, and now in the drop down, if I scroll down to the bottom, there should be a URL property. There it is. So I'll click URL, and now we don't actually need to indicate an element for this get attribute activity because it's referencing the parent selector from this attached browser, which is the browser itself. Great. So last, after we do this, of course, let's just assign our URL to the result over here. So I'll put our URL variable, and then we want to close this browser. So I can come to close, close tab, and I'll drag that in over here. So because this close tab is inside the attached browser, I don't need to specify any browser variable. If this close tab was outside the attached browser, I'd need to create a variable. So let me show you how I do that. If I drag this outside the attached browser, I then need to come here and create an output UI browser over here. I'll click create variable, and I'll call this listing browser. Right, and we can see here in the variables panel that listing browser is of browser variable type. Then in the close tab, we can see this requires a browser variable type. So I'll enter our listing browser variable and click OK. So this should then close the tab after it has been opened. Great, so we still have our log message to log the URL, and it is now getting pulled from this get attribute activity. So let's try run this now. I'm going to come back here, I'm going to close these new tabs, and I'm going to refresh the browser. Let's come here and click run. So there we have it, it's busy loading. Now it should have, oh, there you go. Cool, it just opened a browser tab and closed it. So as it opens it, it's then using the get attribute to scrape the URL, and then it's closing the browser again. So perfect, that's working well. I'm going to stop here and let's view the output. There you go. So there is our actual URL, and you can see these URLs are different as opposed to before when they were all the same. So that is good. So it's scraping, and we can see there the name Fiat Punto Evo, Fiat Punto Evo. So it's basically grabbing the correct URL, which is perfect. So what's nice about this method is now that we are opening each of these browsers, we can actually use getText to scrape any of these properties that we want. So we can simply just add a getText into our loop over here inside our attached to car listing browser. We can simply drag in a getText, and then we can scrape anything we want inside that browser and save it to a variable. So what's powerful about that is using the UiPath data scraping wizard, you can only scrape the data that's available on the surface level on these listings over here. Whereas what we've set up now, we are actually able to click into each of the listings, and we are then able to scrape any data inside, including the URL of the browser. Right, so I hope this was helpful. If you want to download this bot, there'll be a link in the description of this video, and you can then provide your email address, and I'll then send you this this bot as well as all the other bots we have built in this YouTube channel. And yeah, if this video is helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching. Cheers.